The land had grown quiet around Elias, quiet in a way that was not peace but absence. The ranch lay spread beneath the high New Mexico sky, its fences leaning, its corrals empty, its house marked by weather and time. Elias moved through it alone. Each morning he saddled no horse, for there were none left. Each evening he sat in the rocking chair that had once creaked beneath his wife's hand, his pipe sending up pale smoke into the dark rafters. He had buried her beneath a cottonwood, and 2 small graves lay beside hers, and though he no longer wept, something in him had turned to stone the day he packed the soil down flat with the back of his shovel. That evening, dusk brought a storm building over the ridges, purple clouds bruising the horizon. Elias was checking the north fence when he saw her, small, thin, mud streaked across her bare arms, her braid heavy with dust. She stood beyond the posts, swaying as if the earth itself shifted beneath her. For a moment he thought she might be some spirit conjured by grief, a figure of the land itself. But then she lifted her chin, eyes dark and sharp even in her weakness, and he knew she was flesh and blood. She did not beg. That was what struck him first. Her lips were cracked, her breath shallow, yet when he reached into his thul bag and offered her a piece of cornbread, she shook her head. Her pride seemed greater than her frailty. He watched her knees tremble, and still she would not take it. The wind carried the smell of rain, sharp and metallic. A few drops struck the dust at their feet, raising small puffs. Elias felt the weight of choice pressing on him. Strangers out here meant trouble more often than not. Apache meant more trouble still, for the borderlands remembered blood. His hand brushed the butt of his rifle before he caught himself. At last she spoke, her voice low, steady despite the storm inside it. "I cannot live without a man." The words struck him harder than thunder. They were not the tones of pleading, but of fact, carved out of bone-deep truth. She said them as one might say the river must run downhill. Her gaze did not waver from his, though shame flickered like lightning across her face. Elias stood in silence, rain beginning to patter against his hat brim. His own heart gave no answer, only the ache of graves and empty rooms. But he saw how the storm pressed down on her, how the wide land would swallow her if he turned away. Slowly, he lifted the gate latch and let it fall open. Inside his house, the air smelled of old wood and ashes. He set a tin plate before her, cornbread and beans cooling fast. She did not touch them at once, sitting stiff, her back straight as a bowstring, as if waiting for betrayal. When at last hunger overcame pride, she ate with quiet, careful bites, never lowering her eyes. Elias sat across the room in his chair, rocking slow, the creak of wood the only sound. The fire in the hearth burned low, throwing shadows against the walls. Elias studied her from that dim corner, the way her shawl clung wet to her shoulders, the way her hands trembled when she thought he was not looking. She seemed carved of stone and yet breaking apart all at once. He wondered if he had been the same, the day he first sat alone by the graves. No words passed between them that night, save those first ones, words that hung in the rafters like smoke. He did not offer kindness, nor did he drive her away. Instead, he let the silence stand between them, as cold and sharp as the storm that lashed the windows. When he rose at last to bank the fire, Elias caught himself glancing at her form curled near the hearth, already drifting into uneasy sleep. Something long frozen within him stirred, faint as embers beneath ash. It was not hope, nor forgiveness. Only the weight of knowing that the silence of his house had been broken, and might never return the same again. The days unfolded with the slow rhythm of chores, each task weighted by silence. Morning light fell across the hard ground, and Nayeli was already moving before Elias rose, her shadow bending over the well rope, her arms taut as she drew water hand over hand. She mended harness leather with deft stitches, her fingers working without pause, as if labor itself might keep the memories at bay. She ground maize with a stone Elias had not touched in years, its worn surface shining again beneath her persistence. She moved like one who knew the value of small things, the pot left clean, the tack hung straight, the shawl folded tight. Elias watched her from doorways and windows, his pipe smoke curling in slow rings that broke apart in the still air. He did not interfere, nor thank her, nor question her presence. The house, long accustomed to emptiness, now bore 2 bodies in it, and the air seemed altered by her breathing. Yet she spoke little, and when she did, her words were clipped, spare as winter branches. At night, when the wind pressed against the shutters, the fire burned between them like a thin barrier. Elias sat in his rocking chair, the same chair that had once held his wife when she mended shirts, the same chair where he had cradled a fever-stricken child until the small chest grew still. In the firelight he sometimes saw them, his wife in her wedding dress, pale and laughing, a vision from a world that no longer touched this one. The memory would strike like a knife, sharp in its suddenness, before fading into the smoke. Nayeli, too, was visited by shadows. Sometimes in the dark she touched the end of her braid as if to be sure it was still there. Once, Elias found her staring into the embers long after the fire had burned low, her face as still as carved wood. He knew without asking that she saw raiders and fire, heard the screams of kin, and felt the sting of a blade against her scalp. She bore her past as he bore his, silently, without complaint, but never without weight. One evening, when her work was done, she drifted to the corner where his tools rested. She ran her hand along the saddle, its leather cracked, the horn polished by years of use. She traced the rifle barrel with her fingers, lingering on the scratches that marked it. Her eyes fell on the rocking chair, creaking under his weight, and she seemed to measure the way he clung to these things, as though they were threads holding him to life. In her gaze was no mockery, only recognition. Elias noticed, though he pretended not to. He kept his eyes on the fire, but he felt the sharpness of her study. He understood then that she, too, kept tokens, her braid, her songs murmured into the night, the fragments of language she whispered when she thought he did not hear. Two people abandoned by the world, each clinging to remnants others would have cast aside. They seldom spoke, yet something passed between them nonetheless. A glance held a moment too long. A tool left sharpened without request. A cup of water set on the table within reach. These were not gestures of affection, but of endurance, the quiet ways one soul acknowledged another. When Elias rose from his chair one night, the fire burned low, and Nayeli's head had bowed against her folded arms. For a moment he simply stood, looking at her as one might look upon a mirror dulled by smoke, seeing not himself, but the same solitude reflected. He laid another log on the fire, the sparks rising bright, and let her sleep without waking her. In that act, small though it was, something shifted. Neither had spoken of their grief, but each had felt its weight in the other's silence. And in that silence, as in the hush before dawn, there was the faintest trace of respect, fragile as a breath. The storm came rolling down from the mountains like a herd of black cattle, horns of lightning splitting the horizon, the air heavy with the taste of iron. Elias had seen such weather before and knew the signs. He had just stepped out to secure the barn door when he spotted a rider cutting across the slope, his silhouette jagged against the rising wall of clouds. The man reined in at the gate, shoulders hunched beneath a slicker, a bottle of whiskey visible in his thul bag. Elias recognized him, Caleb from the next valley over, a man who had shared trail dust with him years ago, before loss had turned Elias inward. Caleb's eyes were quick, restless, measuring the place, the land, the house. His gaze found the figure standing in the shadow of the doorway. Nayeli, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, met his stare without lowering her eyes. Caleb's mouth twisted. "You keeping company with one of them?" His voice carried scorn edged with suspicion. "Don't tell me you've grown so lonely you'd take in trouble." Elias said nothing at first. Rain began to fall in wide drops, striking the dust into dark circles. He set his hand against the gatepost and let the silence stretch until Caleb shifted in his saddle. Finally, Elias spoke, his voice even, low. "Storm's coming fast. If you've business, speak it plain." Caleb leaned forward, the whiskey bottle clinking as his horse shifted. "You know as well as I do, where there's one, there'll be others. They don't come alone. You're playing with fire, Elias. Don't expect neighbors to come running if it catches." The words dropped like stones. Elias felt their weight, but he did not show it. His face remained as still as the land around them. "She's under my roof," he said. "That's all there is to it." Caleb spat into the mud, muttered something under his breath, then tugged his reins. "Suit yourself. Don't say I didn't warn you." He turned his horse just as the rain broke loose in sheets, driving man and beast into the grey curtain. Elias stood for a moment, watching until the rider vanished, then closed the gate against the storm. By the time he stepped inside, water streamed from his hat brim. The roof rattled under the downpour, thunder shaking the windows in their frames. The fire sputtered, its smoke drawn back down the chimney by the wind's hard pull. Nayeli knelt before the hearth, her braid dripping, her hands folded tight in prayer. Her lips moved soundlessly, her eyes closed, her whole body swaying with the rhythm of words spoken only to the unseen. For a long moment Elias watched her, the storm outside crashing against the walls, the storm within him no less fierce. At last he moved, setting his rifle aside, then pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. He placed one near her without speaking. She opened her eyes, startled, as if she had forgotten his presence. Her fingers curled around the cup, the steam rising to her face. Elias sat across from her, the firelight throwing shadows across his weathered features. The storm's fury seemed to push them closer, binding them in its noise. He did not ask about her prayer, nor did she offer an explanation. They drank in silence, the bitter taste of coffee mingling with the scent of rain seeping through the cracks. For the first time, the space between them did not feel like emptiness, but like shelter. Two figures held in the same storm, their words unnecessary, their vigil shared. Outside, thunder rolled. Inside, the quiet between them spoke more than speech could bear. The storm passed, but it left its weight behind. The days that followed carried a silence different from the one before, heavier, burdened not just with grief but with unspoken questions. Elias went about his chores with more caution, the memory of Caleb's warning gnawing at him. He did not speak of it, but the unease lingered in the set of his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near the rifle even when no threat pressed close. Nayeli felt it. She carried water from the well, gathered wood, swept the dust from corners long untouched, yet the air between them stayed taut as wire. She sensed his distance, the way his eyes flicked toward her but seldom lingered, the way his jaw tightened when neighbors' hoofbeats echoed faintly in the distance. Still, she worked, silent and steady, as though labor could soften suspicion. At night, when the house sank into darkness and the fire burned low, she sometimes sang in a voice so soft it barely carried beyond the hearth. The melodies wound like smoke, thin threads of her people's sorrow braided with remembrance. Elias sat in his chair, the creak of it joining her song, though he never asked what the words meant. He only watched the fire paint her shadow long across the wall, her voice both foreign and familiar, a reminder that solitude need not always be empty. One evening, returning from the barn, Elias stepped inside to find her bent over cloth by the fire. His breath caught. In her lap lay a torn shawl, one he had not touched in years. It had belonged to his wife, the weave frayed, the hem ripped in places where time and neglect had eaten it through. Nayeli's hands moved carefully, guiding the needle, mending what had seemed beyond repair. A rush of feeling broke through him so sudden it nearly drove words to his lips. Rage, how dare she touch what was sacred? Grief, at the sight of it brought back to life when the body that had worn it lay beneath the earth. Gratitude, sharp and painful, that another set of hands could honor what his heart could not bear to tend. All three tangled inside him, choking his breath. He set his cup down too hard, the tin clattering against the table. Nayeli looked up quickly, her eyes wide, her hands freezing over the fabric. For a long moment neither moved. The fire popped, throwing sparks, and Elias felt the urge rise in him to tell her to leave, to send her into the night before the ground shifted further beneath his feet. But she bowed her head instead, laying the shawl aside as if it were too heavy to hold. Her voice came low, halting, each word carved from effort. I also left. I was left. Cast away. As if I was nothing. The words hung in the air, fragile as a thread of smoke. Elias's throat tightened. He gripped his cup, though his hand trembled, the warmth of the coffee spilling against his skin. He did not answer aloud, but his silence shifted. The fire crackled, filling the space where words would not go. Nayeli did not look up again, her gaze fixed on the shawl folded neatly on her knees. Elias watched her, the shape of her shoulders bowed under weight too great for her years. He knew the feeling. He had lived it. He lifted the cup to his lips, though the coffee had gone cold, his hand still shaking. He held it there as if the act itself might steady him, as if the unspoken truth in the room required nothing more than presence. Across the fire, she did not press her confession further. She had given him her truth and asked for nothing in return. The silence deepened, no longer sharp, but heavy, shared. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, carrying the scent of sage and earth washed clean by rain. Inside, two souls sat with their wounds bared, saying nothing, yet hearing much. The sound of hoofbeats carried long before the riders came into sight. Elias had been mending a gate hinge when he heard it, the faint thunder rolling over the dry earth. He straightened slowly, set aside the hammer, and reached for his rifle. By the time the men crested the rise, the rocking chair on the porch was still swaying from where he had left it, as though it mourned his absence. Caleb rode at their head, his slicker gone, a rifle resting easy across his saddle. Two others flanked him, their faces hard, their eyes fixed on the house. Dust rose around the horses' hooves, the air brittle with tension. Nayeli appeared in the doorway, her shawl drawn close, her braid catching the wind. The moment Caleb's gaze found her, his lip curled. "You've kept her," he said flatly. "You know what they've done. Ambushes on the river road, families burned out. You'd harbor one of them here, in your own house." Elias stood in the doorway, rifle in his hands, his figure blocking the path inside. The wind tugged at his shirt, the boards beneath his boots creaked, but his voice did not waver. "She's under my roof." "That roof won't stand against the fire she brings," Caleb spat. "She'll draw her kind like wolves. And when they come, you'll have no one to blame but yourself." Nayeli stepped forward then, her eyes lowered, her hands clenched at her sides. Her voice trembled but held steady. "I will go." The word struck like the crack of a branch. She believed herself cursed, marked to bring ruin wherever she set foot. She moved as if to step past Elias. But his arm shot out, barring the way, steady as a post sunk deep into the earth. His rifle gleamed in the sun, his stance wide, unmoving. "No," he said, the single word sharp as iron. "She stays." The air thickened. Caleb's hand hovered near his rifle strap, the other men shifting in their saddles, their fingers twitching close to triggers. For a heartbeat, the whole land seemed to hold its breath. Overhead, thunder rolled, low and heavy, the storm gathering again over the ridges. The smell of rain drifted down, sharp with electricity. Elias did not flinch. "This is my land," he said, his voice carrying like the rumble of the storm. "My house. What happens here is mine to answer for." The standoff stretched, brittle as glass. Nayeli's breath came quick, her heart drumming against her ribs. Caleb's eyes narrowed, but he read something in Elias's face that told him this was no bluff. This was a man who had already buried everything he loved, a man with nothing left to fear except Dishner beneath his own roof. At last Caleb spat into the dust. "So be it," he muttered. He jerked his reins, turned his horse, and the others followed, though not without glancing back, muttering their threats. Their hoofbeats faded into the distance, swallowed by the growing thunder. Elias lowered the rifle but did not set it aside. He turned slowly toward the doorway where Nayeli stood, her face pale, her lips pressed tight. Inside, the fire burned low, its light flickering against the walls, casting both their shadows tall across the room. She looked at him as though seeing him for the first time, not as the man who had offered her a cold corner and silence, but as one who had placed his body between her and the world. Her scarred heart throbbed with confusion, gratitude, and fear. Elias said nothing. He set the rifle back against the wall, the wood thudding softly. Then he sank into the rocking chair, its creak filling the silence. Nayeli stepped nearer the fire, her hands clutching the shawl. The flames licked upward, painting her face in gold, his in bronze, both lit by the same defiance, the same quiet vow neither spoke aloud. The storm broke at last, rain hammering the tin roof, thunder rattling the glass. But inside, the fire held steady, casting its glow over two souls who had chosen, if only for this night, to stand shoulder to shoulder against the darkness pressing in. The riders did not return. The threat hung in the air like a scent of smoke after fire, but the land remained quiet, yielding only wind through the mesquite and the creak of saddles in the empty barn. Days settled back into their rhythm, chores marked the hours, and silence filled the space between. Yet the silence had changed. It was no longer barren but waited, like soil turned and waiting for seed. Each dawn, Elias poured 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. They drank by the doorway, watching the sky blush pale above the ridges. They spoke little, but when they did, the words carried weight. She asked once how his wife had died, and he answered in few syllables, his voice tight as rope. He asked once where Nayeli's people had gone, and she bowed her head, saying only, "Scattered." The words did not need more. Between them grew an understanding built not on speech, but on the shared act of staying. At last the day came when Elias saddled his horse and hitched the wagon. He told Nayeli they were going to town. Her hand stilled over the shawl she was folding, her eyes flicking to him with both fear and resolve. She said nothing, but she climbed into the wagon without protest. The road stretched dusty before them, lined with sage and the bleached bones of old fences. The town appeared small against the horizon, roofs glinting in the sun, smoke rising from chimneys. As they entered, faces turned. Men paused in their talk, women's hands froze over baskets of bread. The sight of an Apache girl in a patched shawl seated beside the rancher was enough to draw whispers. Elias felt the eyes burn against his back but kept his head straight, his hands steady on the reins. In the general store, the murmur quieted but did not vanish. Nayeli walked at his side, her steps measured, her chin lifted though her fingers clutched her shawl. She felt the stares, the judgment like knives. Elias gathered what he needed, coffee beans, nails, a sack of flour, his movements deliberate, unhurried. At the counter stood an old woman, her face lined deep, her eyes sharp with the years. She looked from Elias to Nayeli and lingered on the braid that hung over her shoulder, dark against the worn shawl. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, without a word, she reached behind the counter and set a spool of white thread into Nayeli's hand. Nayeli stared down at it, her lips parting, but no words came. The woman gave a small nod, as if passing on something greater than cloth or cord. A permission. A blessing. The rest of the store faded around them. Nayeli closed her fingers around the thread, her throat tightening. Elias paid for the goods, and together they stepped back into the sunlight, the whispers trailing behind like shadows that could no longer reach. The wagon rattled out of town, the land widening with each mile. The air turned golden as the sun bent westward, the long grasses swaying like a sea. Nayeli lifted her face to the wind, her eyes closing, the spool of thread still in her lap. For the first time since Elias had seen her, her expression softened into something near peace. He studied her profile in the fading light, the strength in the line of her jaw, the fragility in the way her hands cradled the small spool as if it were the weight of her whole destiny. She no longer seemed a stranger on his land, nor a shadow in his house. She seemed instead a partner, one scarred by abandonment, as he was, but still here, still choosing to endure. By the time the ranch came into view, dusk had wrapped the sky in violet and gold. The rocking chair waited on the porch, still and silent. Elias slowed the horses, feeling the trail beneath the wheels steady beneath him. Nayeli looked back once, then forward again, her eyes on the wide land that was now theirs to share. They returned not as two forsaken souls bound only by necessity, but as two who had chosen, quietly, stubbornly, to walk the rest of the road together.